as well. Chapter 11, the chapter of the Rasha. And with that, a certain level of discomfort. Because the second we hear the word Rasha, we think, are you talking to me? What? Are you casting aspersions over here? Are you? So what exactly is this Rasha? How does a person become a Rasha? Last week we spoke about the fact that this is positioned very specifically in the 11th chapter because amongst other things, it does carry the promise that a Rasha has the capacity to turn it all around and to become a heroic figure, spiritually successful individual. So just remind ourselves of that before we get into the detail. Now, last week we left off by saying that there's going to be a spectrum, because the principle is ze leumas ze, that whatever Hashem created has a mirror image. So if there's a spectrum of tzaddikim, then there must be a spectrum of rashoim. And we said that the nature of a tzaddik is defined as somebody that has, at the very least, has complete control over their negative inclinations. So tzaddik, the lesser tzaddik, is called tzaddik ve'ra loi. The tzaddik, and in the most simplistic translation, he has a little bit of bad in his system. But in the more advanced translation, ve'ra, whatever negative exists within the system, loi, is under his control. It's under his jurisdiction. So that implies that the tzaddik is somebody who, the definition of the various kinds of tzaddik would be, to what extent do they have mastery over whatever negative lies in their system. Now, the ultimate mastery, as we learned, is the tzaddik gomer. That's somebody who not only has absolute control over any negative within their system, within the world actually, but is absolutely focused on and engaged with the transformation of negative into positive. So if we have the spectrum of tzaddikim, we have to anticipate a spectrum of rashoim. And if the basis of what makes a tzaddik is the level of mastery that the tzaddik has over their so-called left side, the negative traits that the person has, the toxic strains in their system, if that is the definition of a tzaddik, then we have to anticipate that the definition of a rasha is not, as people would say, a criminal, a rogue, a rebel, a terror. A rasha is somebody who allows the bad side of themselves to have mastery over them. And what will create the spectrum of what kind of a rasha a person is will depend on how that negative takes control of the positive. And I kind of hinted last week that we're going to be looking at the difference between quality and quantity, meaning to say that this might be partly a factor of how much of me is controlled by the negative, or how frequently I am controlled by the negative, on the one hand. And on the other hand, a big component of it is what element of me, of my life, is controlled by the negative. So that's why you'll see that the vast majority of this chapter, which, as I mentioned last week, is quite a short chapter, the vast majority is actually examples to illustrate the spectrum. And for that reason, besides the fact that it may feel a little bit uncomfortable to people, speaking about a rasha, but actually because of that, because we're dealing primarily with examples, the pace of this chapter might actually be a little quicker than some of the other chapters that we have learned. So if you have the Tanya book, we're on page 44. And I'm going to pop it here onto the screen so everybody can see where we are. And we started off by saying Zelu Maseh, that there are these two mirror image realities, the tzaddik ve'raloi and the rasha v'toivloi, that there is this person who is a tzaddik which has complete mastery over any negative elements of their personality. And le'umasoi, in the opposite corner, or the mirror image, or the reversed version of that tzaddik is rasha v'toiv loi. The rasha who toiv loi, the good within them, is sometimes prey to the bad within them. So we described it as, just to borrow some of the words from last week, we described it hatoiv shebenafshay hoilikis, that the definition of a rasha is somebody who the goodness that they have by virtue of the neshama, sheba moichoi, which dwells primarily in the mind, of a chala yimani shebelibo, as well as in the so-called right-hand side of the heart, kafuf ubatel legabe hara mehakripa shebechal asmali, is to some extent, under the sway or the spell of the negative that lies in the left-hand side of the heart. So that's kind of what we spoke about last week, and now we're going to look at examples. So if you have a look, we are on the fourth line in this chapter. So the fourth line, regardless of whether you're using the book or looking on the screen, it's the fourth line from the beginning of the chapter. And we are right in the middle of that line, the word v'zeh. V'zeh, this reality, that the Rasha's soul is being swayed by or even overcome by the negativity within themselves, mischalek gamkein, is also something that could be split up or that could be divided, l'riva voice madregos, to numerous, riva voice is actually myriads of levels. Okay, somebody's asking an interesting question here. So is being a tzaddik or being a rasha a matter of free will? It's a really interesting question because clearly one of the foundational beliefs of Judaism is free will. Not only that, but the Torah tells us very clearly that Hashem gives us the choice. I'm offering to you today goodness and life, or God forbid the opposite, and then Hashem gives us good advice. He says, you should choose life. So that indicates that we have the option to choose the opposite, right? So to be a rasha is something we could choose. That's the principle. The principle is we always have free choice. But like any good principle, it does have a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is, right in the beginning of Tanya, in the first chapter, one of the questions that the Alter Rebbe raised is that there is a Talmudic passage that paraphrases the words of a man called Job, who's the so-called suffering servant. The person has a lot of bad mazel in his life. And at some point, the Talmud says, he makes this claim, he says, Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the universe, barasa tzadikim, barasa rashoim. You have created righteous individuals and you have created wicked individuals. So that really sticks a spoke in the wheels of our belief about free choice, because hang on a second, now you're telling me that Hashem creates who are the pious individuals and who are the wicked individuals. So what does that mean? Anybody who is honest and objective, Hilton, the Tanya's on the show. Anybody who's honest or objective will acknowledge the fact that people are different. This whole notion of all people being equal is not accurate. All people should be treated equally. That's a different story. But to suggest that all people are equal is a fallacy. No people are equal. That's the beauty of creation, that everybody is somehow different. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses in areas that differentiate them from the strengths and weaknesses of other people. So we understand that Hashem designed different people to be different. And in that broad picture of that design, we understand that there are people who have been wired to be predisposed to very deep spiritual behavior. And there are people who have been wired to be predisposed to criminal behavior. So to say that we have free choice, absolutely. Do we have free choice whether to be a tzaddik or whether to be a rasha? Not so simple. Because it could be that a person was wired in a particular way where it's not even their choice to be a tzaddik. They were just given all the gifts. Like the very famous statement that the Gemara makes about Moshe, that when Moshe was born, his entire house was filled with this divine light. And the reason it was filled with divine light was because he was wired to be a tzaddik. He didn't have to create the persona of a tzaddik. He was wired to be a tzaddik. And then he has free choice within that spectrum of being a tzaddik. We were all designed to be Rasha'im. That's how we were designed. Does that mean that we could blame our circumstances and say, well, you know what, Hashem made me this way and who am I to argue? No, that's where free choice comes in. We have the free choice to move away from being a rasha. So in the same way, I suppose, as we can make the free choice to be a rasha or to remain a rasha or to choose to be that we want to be a rasha, like almost as if it becomes our persona. But free choice does not necessarily get us to be a tzaddik. Free choice can get us away from being a rasha, and that's probably one of the most important things that we're going to be learning from the next chapter and for quite a number of chapters after that, about the fact that it's not tzaddik versus Russia. There's a very important intermediate stage, which actually is our aspiration. Okay? So is it dependent on free will? Not that absolutely clear. Are our choices to improve or fail dependent on free will? 100%. Okay, so going back to what we're discussing, v'zeh. So this reality of the neshama being in a headlock by the negative side of who I am, can be split into a broad range of literally tens of thousands of nuanced possibilities. And that's probably one of the most valuable things we learn in Tanya, is that life is nuanced. People are so quick to just box everybody in. Oh, that person's a good person, they are a tzaddik. That person's not a good person, they are a rasha. Now that might be factual, but it's not helpful. Because there are nuanced versions of Russia. To put it in a tongue-in-cheek way, some of my best friends are Rashaim. Meaning to say, they don't have to be bad people, they don't have to be criminals. They could be people we look up to. They could be our teachers, our mentors, our spiritual guides, even, and still be a Rasha. Because once we understand the nuance and the subtlety of what a Rasha could be, then we have a completely different perspective about ourselves, about others, about the expectation that Judaism has from us. So what creates these nuances? What creates the grading of the different kinds of Rishonim that might exist? Two things. Be'inyan kamus ve'eichus habitul uchfifas atov lera chas v'sholem. This is going to be determined by the quantum and the caliber, or the quality, of how much or how the neshama is under the spell of the negative side. Let's understand that for a second. Before we get into what the Tanya is going to say, let's just understand this for a second, because subtlety and nuance is really, really important for understanding these things. So, first of all, imagine if we took the whole world and split people into two groups, healthy and diseased. Imagine we did that. Now that might be factual. There might be people who are currently healthy and people who are currently diseased. But if we put all healthy people into the same category and all diseased people into the same category, we would do a terrible disservice to people, and we might actually directly cause people to become more ill or possibly even not survive. Because in the realm of healthy, there are people who are healthy as in they haven't experienced any serious health issues. They're not the same as people who could run ultramarathons or triathletes. They're not the same, even though they're both in the category called healthy. It's also possible that somebody's healthy relative to their age. So if somebody is exhibiting the same health level as an 80-year-old when they are a 20-year-old, well, they might be in the healthy category, but that would actually be unhelpful information. You don't want a 20-year-old to say, I'm healthy by an 80-year-old standards. So we need to have nuance. And the same thing happens with illness. So let's say that there's somebody who currently has a common cold and somebody who has stage 4 dread disease, God forbid. Now, if we put everybody into the category of disease, you'd make the person with a common cold feel like who knows what's going to happen to them because they're in the same category as somebody who's lying in an ICU bed. So we understand in other areas of life that there has to be nuance, obviously. We also understand in our interrelationships that there is nuance. For example, we could put everybody into two categories. We could say, my friends and not my friends. So the vast majority of human beings are not my friends, and then I have a circle of friends. But in my circle of friends, obviously, there are very different relationships, as in the circle of my non-friends. You know, there could be people who are my acquaintances. They're not my friends, but we have interaction and maybe even mutually beneficial It could be that some of those people are service providers in my life. Could be a doctor. Could be a lawyer, right? Could be the insurance policy guy. So they are part of my life, but they're not friends. They're completely different to random strangers that I happen to brush past in the supermarket aisle. So we have to understand that life obviously is nuanced in all other areas. Surely it should be nuanced in this area too. And what determines that nuance is going to be quality and quantity. Again, something that we could understand from our own lives. Imagine if, and it's possible for a society to do this, technically, imagine if we divided the whole society into law-abiding and criminal. Now, our knee-jerk reaction to that would be, that's going to be really useful, because now we know who the good guys are, now we know who the bad guys are, until we discover that we might be put in the criminal category. Because what's the definition of a crime? Breaking the law. So, there may be criminals who are wanted for murder, and there may be criminals who went over the speed limit. So if I'm going to talk about criminals versus law-abiding citizens, it's not going to be very helpful. And the same thing, if I'm going to say tzaddik versus Rasha and just, paint all Rishonim with the same brush, that's going to be useless. So what distinguishes one criminal from the next? Let's do this as an exercise. What distinguishes the kind of criminal who still belongs very much in the normal society versus the criminal who deserves to have some kind of punishment? What would the difference be? Intent. Okay, so intent is definitely a factor. Right? Let's talk about intent. Of course, it's a big issue. Right? Big issue right now with the whole throwing around the word genocide as if it were popcorn. So intent is a very significant part of how you determine whether or not there is, God forbid, a genocide, right? So by the same token, there's the person who, much more innocuous example, the person who speeds because they want to show the cops that they don't care, versus the person who just wasn't paying attention to the speedometer. So intent, where does intent fit? Does that fit into the quality or the quantity element of the crime? Intent. Quality, right? Quality. But here's where things get a little bit fuzzy. So, what happens if somebody does something that really upsets us? And then they apologize and they say, I'm sorry, I did not intend to upset you. Is that acceptable? I mean, it is, right? So, okay, I didn't realize, I didn't understand that this was a touchy subject for you, whatever. I had absolutely no malicious intent, and I apologize wholeheartedly for having upset you. We'll let it go, because the quality of that crime is a very low-grade crime because there was no intent. What if they do it again? The same thing. And then we get hurt again. And again we say to them, I was hurt by what you said or what you did. And again they say, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. We'll say, okay, that can happen. Could be that it's not top of mind for you. We live in two different headspaces. So, all right, I'll let it go again. And then it repeats a third time. We're no longer going to judge that with the same tolerance that we did the first or maybe the second time. So that's where things get a bit fuzzy. Sometimes the quantity does impact the quality, the severity of the event. So if a person gets a slap on the wrist from the police because they did something which was on the edge of the law, and then they're in court again a month or so later, what will the judge call them? A repeat offender. A repeat offender has a different category to a first-time offender. So we need to know that we're going to be looking both at the quality and at the quantity, and understanding that repeating the quantity impacts the quality. Or quality is maybe not the easiest word to use over here, because quality implies something positive often. But the severity of the crime. So repetition does relate also to severity. So these are the things that we're going to be looking at. Intent, repetition, what a person does, because that obviously also makes a difference. So there's the big difference between minor crimes, major crimes, crimes that are, so to speak, to borrow a phrase, crimes of passion, meaning to say, I just was in the heat of the moment, versus crimes of strategy, of intent. Even on Yom Kippur, we use this expression. It's possibly one of the most scary lines in Al Chet. We say, Al Chet shechatonu lefonecha b'yetzer hara. For the sins that we have committed with our yetzer hara, our evil inclination. Well, who else does the sins? Isn't that the full-time job of the yetzer hara, to cause us to sin? So one of the interpretations is, no, these are the sins even the yetzer hara didn't want to do. But we convinced it that this would be a good idea. So that's like a scary line. In other words, a person comes up with a plan knowing that every part of themselves is screaming, don't do this, and saying, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. So that would obviously increase the severity of the particular crime. So in each case, how we're going to determine this, remember that the Rasha v'toiv loy means that the goodness within the Rasha's soul is being overwhelmed and controlled by the negative. So what's going to determine the spectrum is how frequently does the negative side get the upper hand, and how severely does it affect me when it does. Those are going to be the two measures. So let's start from the what we'll call Rasha light. Right, that's the person who's in the Rasha category, but not really so bad. Close to our first-time offender, and maybe even less than that. So Yeshmi, one category of Rasha is Shehakfifa v'habitul etzloi, that the experience of the neshama being overwhelmed and almost controlled by the negative within the person is me'at mizeir, very, very small, minuscule impact. So let's try and understand what that looks like. What does that look like? For example, maybe this is the person who occasionally, harav haras, does not join the minyan to daven. Now, for many people are going to say, oh, I wish that was my issue, right? But let's think about this objectively for a moment. If a person is aware of the fact that we're meant to pray together in unison as a minyan, and then they don't do it, what's happened at that moment? What's happened is the negative thought process got the upper hand. My neshama did not get to express its intention. There was another part of me that took control. Now, let's be honest. Missing the minyan is a bad thing for the individual. But let's just say the minyan had 10 other people without them. Have they impacted anybody else? Have they caused any damage to anybody else? Have they wrecked the world? Have they made anybody's lives a misery? No. So it's ma'at mezeir. It's kind of possibly one of those things that you could say would be on the scale of minor offenses. Minor offenses. Okay, I'm going to leave the guilt question for now. It's a good question. How valuable is it to feel guilty? So we're going to learn about guilt. I don't believe we'll get there this week, but a significant part of our conversation is going to be about guilt. Very interesting part of the conversation. So hold that thought. Okay, so the first experience of Rasha that we're describing is the person who has Rasha moments that are minor. And these minor issues are infrequent. You almost get the feeling now we're going to start to create one of those grids, So you're going to have major, minor, frequent, infrequent. And that's how we're going to chart where we are on the Rasha scale, right? Minor, major, frequent, infrequent. So if you're minor, infrequent, you're doing well. If it's major, frequent, that's a problem. Major, infrequent is a little bit better. Minor, frequent is a little bit better than that, right? Okay, so you get the picture of the kind of graph that we would create. So this person is ma'at mizeir, very minor issues, and even that is, it's not regular, right? Ein bit tmidus. So the first word that he uses is tmidus, which is actually consistent. Constant. This is not somebody who has this constant, chronic spiritual issue. Not only that, it's not even something that happens in short bursts. So, instead of the person who misses the minyan every single day, which would be called tamid, it's not even the person who misses the minyan every single Sunday, which is liprakim, or maybe once a month. The best kind of Rasha to be is the Rasha who only falls for the influences of the negative side of their being occasionally. Itim rechoikim. There are big gaps between failures. And when those gaps happen, then misgaber hora al hatoiv, after one of those long hiatuses of no spiritual problems, then suddenly the negative gets the upper hand. V'koivesh esair ketanahu haguf, and borrowing the metaphor we used in chapter 9, the negative conquers that miniature body called the human being, and then of course the human being is behaving accordingly. Now, you do realize that if we're talking about somebody who has these long stretches of no, it's like the construction sites, where they have those signs, 103 days accident free. So that's kind of what this Rasha is like. This Rasha is, I've gone now, I'm clean 6 months. Almost like a recovering Rasha. Maybe that's what we'll call them, right? I've gone 6 months clean. Now, the problem is, because the pattern of this Rasha's experience of the negative within themselves is infrequent, it becomes really difficult for them to know when they're actually in the clear. Right? Because it's infrequent. So a whole lot of months went past. Okay, but you know what? The truth is, if I'm honest about it, a whole lot of months went past before the previous incident as well. So this person has to be somebody who's quite vigilant, because they're actually used to the fact that there's long stretches of being just fine, and that could lull them into a false sense of security. That's not what we're focusing on. Now we're focusing on the definition of the best of the Rasha bunch. Very minor transgressions, very infrequently, and one more piece of information about them, and that is that achloi kuloi ela miktsasoi, that even when the Yetzer Hara, we're just going to use that term because it's probably the most recognizable term for the toxic part of the human being. So when the Yetzer Hara does take control of the miniature city, which is the human being, it actually does not control the whole entity. That the Yetzer Hara is not able to get the person to completely veer to follow its encouragement. So at best, at very best, the Yetzer Hara will be able to take control over one element of the human being. Now, it's at this point that we start to put together some of the tapestry that we've created over a number of chapters, because in chapters 1 and 2, we spoke about the fact that there are two souls: the animal soul, which effectively ensures that we survive, and the godly soul, which pushes us to aspire and to transcend and to connect to Hashem. We also spoke about the fact that the neshama, both of them, but we're going to talk right now about the godly soul, is made up of 10 soul powers. Chokhmah, Bina, Das, all the way down to Malchus, 10 facets that make up the neshama. So that is who we are. And then we said, in addition to who we are, there is also how we present to the world. And we do not present who we are to the world. We present aspects of who we are to the world. And we do that through thought, speech, and action, which in chapter 4 we called the garments of the soul. Meaning to say, just in the same way as a person could change their garments and it wouldn't change who they are, so we could change the way that we think or speak or act, and it wouldn't fundamentally change who we are. That's quite valuable information. Over here, when we're talking about the so-called Rasha light, this is the person who is not a bad Rasha, In other words, they're not caught up in really ongoing, malicious, toxic behavior. So when the Yetzer Hara gets the better of them, it's usually in one of the spheres. They might think inappropriately, they might speak inappropriately, they might act inappropriately. Let's pause here for a moment. Do any of us, you do not have to answer this question, ever suffer from a sense of imposter syndrome? Which means we feel like hypocrites. Because here I am, showing the whole world how committed I am to my Judaism and how religious I am. And I've got the hat, and I've got the tickle, and I've got the tzitzis, and I've got the beard, and I've got whatever. But I know what goes on in my head. I know the thoughts that cross my mind that should not be there. I know the things that I do when nobody's looking. I know the things that I say that I really should not say. And we quite easily slip into this very heavy, self-deprecating analysis, which says, I'm obviously a fraud. So it's quite useful for us to have a look at this piece of Tanya and start to learn an objective tool for assessment, for self-assessment. So the objective tool is, if one part of me is misaligned from the rest of me, that could actually be a good sign. Because let's remember, we are most likely 90% chance in the Rasha category. And the definition of the Rasha category is that our neshama occasionally or frequently succumbs to the negative drives inside us. That's what a Rasha is. Again, a Rasha is not somebody who should be excommunicated. A Rasha is not somebody who's going down the hatch after 120 years. A Rasha is simply somebody who gives in to temptation or distraction or laziness or vice or anger. That is a Rasha. Which means I need an objective tool to assess where on the Rasha spectrum am I. Because it could be that yes, I succumb, I fail at times, but there are other times, possibly even bigger pieces of time, where I don't. And maybe I succumb in one area of life, thought or speech or action at a time. And that means I, the holistic me, am not a loser. So this is quite useful for us. Now, the purpose of this chapter is not to mollycoddle, it's not to pamper us, it's not to avoid being honest when we are introspective, when we gaze at our soul in the mirror. But as important as it is not to be too forgiving of ourselves, because that's not helpful for spiritual development, it is equally important not to be too harsh on ourselves, because that becomes a trap that we feel we can never extricate ourselves from, and therefore we're losers, and why even bother? So it's really important for us to develop this objective assessment tool of what a Rasha is. Here's the first assessment we have to do with ourselves. The kind of things I do wrong, how severe are they from a Jewish perspective, not from my personal value system perspective. From a Jewish perspective, how serious are they? Question number 2, how frequently does this happen? Question number 3, how much of me gets sucked into it at a time? Because it is possible for a person to do something they shouldn't, and at the same time think, I know I shouldn't be doing this. Or it is possible for a person to have enough self-control not to do something wrong, and their head is saying, I really wish I could be doing that. And maybe they're even fantasizing about doing it. So it's quite important that we have this sense of a more nuanced approach to where am I on the spiritual spectrum. Let's go further. Dahaino is going to give examples. Oy b'maise levad. One possibility of the person who is on the upper end of the Rasha spectrum, and therefore in a spiritually healthier place, is that the Yetzer Hara will only drag them into misbehavior. What kind of misbehavior? So here's the next part of our objective self-assessment tool. La'asois averos kalois. Only to do those kinds of things that are the lighter end of transgressions. Now again, That cannot be a matter of my subjective interpretation, because we're really good at that as people. We are really good at saying the things I do are not the bad things. It's what you do that are the bad things, right? That's typically how we look at the world, It's the driving in traffic syndrome, right? Where anybody who's in front of me is driving too slowly, and anybody who's behind me is a mashugana. So it's the same kind of principle where effectively we're saying that anybody who does the averos that I do, that's understandable. But if you do things that I would never do, there's obviously something wrong with you. So we can't look at ourselves from a subjective standard. We need an objective standard. The Torah does distinguish between more severe transgressions and less severe transgressions. So my self-assessment is the kind of things that I do, are they more or less severe? Now, how do I test that? How do I test if the kind of things I'm doing are more or less severe? Well, I could do some research and I could read up what the Torah has to say, because there might be things that we feel are not so severe, and actually they are. So a good place to start would be to read the sources and see what does the Torah actually think about these things. And until we get there, until we've learned these things, we can also, at least to a certain extent, trust our own intuition. Is this something I wouldn't want anybody to know about? Or is this something which, we kind of all do it? That would be part of the scale that a person could potentially use, although it's an unreliable scale, and that's what we actually have to learn what the Torah has to say. So that's the one possibility. Lasses averos kalois veloy chamuras chas v'sholem, where a person does the kind of transgression which is the lighter transgression. They waited 5 hours and 55 minutes between the burger and the dessert, and not 6 full hours, versus chamurois, which is the person who used the pump-action shotgun to explain to their neighbor why they didn't agree with the way they parked their car. Okay, so we understand, obviously, that these are, there's a spectrum. Or bedibur levad, or it's possible, and this might be a little bit better, where a person is not failing in behavior. Halavai, right? Let's be honest. Halavai, we could say, I don't fail in the region of behavior. It's only my words. Sometimes I'm a little bit too straightforward, a little bit too critical. Sometimes I speak badly about people. Sometimes I use words that are angry. But look at the examples he's going to give. Ledaber avak loshen hora veleitzonos. There's slight ambiguity over here. You could read this as avak loshen hora goes together and leitzonos goes together. But the Rebbe points out that it's avak loshen hora veleitzonos. It's one continuum. Avak means dust, and we have an expression in Jewish law. Everybody knows what loshen hora is, right? What's loshen hora? Spreading factual negative stories about other people. That's loshen hora. If they're not factual, that's a whole different thing. That's called libel. But loshen hora is factual. That's why very often people say it's not loshen hora, it's true. No, that's why it's loshen hora, because it's true. So avak loshen hora is the dust of loshen hora, meaning to say, if you could imagine loshen hora as a big boulder that weighs down on a person. So avak loshen hora is if that boulder had kind of eroded and there was some dust that came off on the edges, which is obviously not nearly as serious. So what falls into the category of avak loshen hora? Loshen hora dust, which is a little bit more sinister, I suppose, than things like pixie dust. So what's loshen hora dust? So here's one example. One example is, a person comes to you and says, I just met so-and-so for the first time. I know you've known them for many years. They are such a wonderful person. Just so menschlich, so down to earth, so honest. And you go, That is loshen hora dust. Didn't say a word. Just a little bit of a facial expression. Loshen hora dust. Oh, here's another one. You go over to somebody who does not like somebody else, and you say, aren't they just amazing? And then the person obviously gives you feedback. So, I didn't say anything. I only spoke positively. Yeah, well, the way you spoke positively seeded negative conversation. So that's avak loshen hora. Now, the reason he's saying this is because we're looking for examples of what is light transgressions. Outright loshen hora would not be a light transgression. That'd be a serious business. So it's loshen hora dust that is considered the light transgression. And the other possibility is avak leitzonos. Now, leitzonos is something that's often misunderstood by people. The word leitzonos, which is related to the modern Hebrew word leitzan. What's a leitzan? A clown is a leitzan. Ah, so everything's leitzanus. Yeah, that means, just empty-headed, joking around, which is very often how we use the expression. But actually the meaning of leitzanus is the belittling of valuable ideas. Cynical, satirical attitudes. That's actually what leitzanus is. So, for example, the person says, you won't believe what happened to me. I believe that the experience, and I tell you the whole experience, was a miracle. And the person says, I don't know if it was a miracle. Maybe you were just in the right place at the right time. Somebody gives a really rousing vort and people are really moved. And then you get somebody who makes a wisecrack at the end that just deflates the whole experience. That's leitzanus. That's a severe transgression. Here we're talking about the person who's on the better end of the Rasha spectrum, so they'll only have avak leitzanus. They're not going to say something which is outright cynical, which is outright deflating something positive that a person said, but they'll skirt on the edge. The person, maybe they'll quote another source that doesn't quite align with the source that you quoted. So now that just drops the bar a little bit about how inspiring your message was, or that kind of thing. And then the last area, so he says v'chi hagavna and other such examples. And then the last area he says oy b'machshava, or the person just fails only in the realm of thought. Machshava levad, only in the realm of thought, but the realm of thought is very tricky. Hirhurei avera hakoshim mei avera. Because when it comes to thinking about a sin, the sages tell us that actually thinking about a sin is in a certain way harsher than doing the sin. So for example, they tell the story that there are two very religious, pious, long coats guys walking on the road. And let's just say the story happens in Amsterdam, let's just say. So they're walking on the streets of Amsterdam and they're walking next to one of the canals, and in the canal they hear screaming and there's a woman who is drowning. So the first guy rips off his black coat, dives into the water, grabs the woman, slaps her to the side, and saves her life. He's now completely drenched. He puts on his black coat. The two Hasidim, or whatever they are, continue to walk down the road. 10 minutes later, his friend says to him, I cannot believe that somebody as frum as you touched another woman, not your wife. So the first guy says to him, listen here, I jumped into the water, I grabbed that woman, I pulled her out of the water, and I left her on the side of the road 10 minutes ago. You are still carrying her. Hirhure avera hakoshim me avera. In a certain respect, what goes on in our heads affects us sometimes more deeply than the things we do. Now, that's never an excuse to say, well, in that case, I may as well just do it rather than think about it. But it is a point for objective assessment. Because if there's stuff ruminating in my head that doesn't belong there, it's actually infecting me in a much more sensitive area of my life than if I did something wrong and it was over and I now felt guilty about it and started working on a way to fix it. So that's why he points out, even though he says it's possible for a person only to have an issue in the area of thought, he immediately says, but you have to realize how sensitive thought is. Because what goes on in the mind typically influences everything else that happens next. And of course, what goes on in the mind affects a very sensitive part of who we are, as opposed to the things that we do. And it's on that note that we'll continue with a conversation about thought, about other things that might distract us from doing what we should. And eventually, for those people who are really desperate to hear about it, we will eventually then also get to the discussion of guilt and feeling guilty, the favorite Jewish pastime, and how much that plays into this assessment of a rasha. That's to be continued.